Welcome to BBIU. This episode is based on a public article from Biopharma Business Intelligence Unit, an independent strategic intelligence platform analyzing biopharma, regulation, geopolitics, capital, and structural risk. We do not treat events as isolated headlines. We read them as signals inside larger systems. This podcast provides a concise public entry point into the issue, while the institutional version develops the full structural assessment for decision makers facing high consequence uncertainty. Germany's 34-point reform package and the industrial tension behind its AI ambition. July 7th, Germany is attempting to restore growth through labor reform, infrastructure investment, administrative acceleration, and support for strategic industries. The deeper question is whether these measures can create productive capacity faster than they generate fiscal cost, implementation pressure, and competition for already scarce resources. Institutional relevance snapshot. What happened? Germany has introduced a 34-point reform program covering pensions, taxation, employment rules, social benefits, housing, electricity grids, administrative procedures, data regulation, artificial intelligence, semiconductors, and strategic industrial investment. The measures include income tax relief, more flexible fixed-term employment, job transition programs, expansion of the Germany Fund, faster grid development, automatic administrative approvals, public sector digitalization, and support for industries including automotive manufacturing, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, batteries, semiconductors, and AI. Why this matters now? The program arrives as Germany faces weak growth, elevated industrial energy costs, demographic pressure, regulatory delays, stronger Chinese competition, and the need to adapt its industrial base to an AI-driven investment cycle. The reforms acknowledge that Germany's previous economic model cannot simply be restored. They do not yet demonstrate that a viable replacement has been built. Who should care? Executive leadership, policymakers, investors and capital allocators, manufacturing leadership, strategy teams, supply chain functions, public affairs teams, technology and infrastructure investors. What type of decision this affects? Capital allocation, geographic exposure, industrial location, partner selection, AI and infrastructure investment, manufacturing planning, long-term market positioning, portfolio prioritization. Executive summary. Germany's 34-point reform package is being presented as a broad response to economic stagnation. The visible interpretation is that the government is attempting to improve labor participation, stimulate investment, reduce bureaucracy, modernize infrastructure, and strengthen strategic industries. That interpretation is directionally correct but incomplete. The program combines measures with very different implementation timelines, fiscal costs, legal dependencies, and economic effects. Tax relief can support household income without materially improving industrial competitiveness. Faster approvals can reduce delay, but only if administrative systems can operate under the new rules. Strategic investment can strengthen national capabilities, but it can also preserve assets that remain structurally uncompetitive. The wider development is not limited to Germany. Advanced economies are reorganizing industrial policy around energy security, semiconductors, AI infrastructure, supply chain resilience, and workforce adaptation. The global system is moving away from cost-only allocation toward a model in which technological access, political reliability, infrastructure, and continuity under disruption carry greater weight. The institutional significance lies in the assumptions now being used to allocate capital. Announced reform does not necessarily equal executed reform. Announced semiconductor or AI investment does not necessarily equal qualified productive capacity. A sector's strategic importance does not automatically make every project in that sector economically viable. The observable surface, Germany's program, contains several measures with potentially material economic consequences. The government intends to implement a pension reform package following the recommendations of the Pension Security Commission. The final parameters remain unresolved, but the reform is expected to address the growing pressure created by an aging population and a shrinking working age base. From 2027, the coalition plans income tax relief focused on lower and middle-income households and families. The annual gross relief is estimated at approximately 10 billion euros, with partial financing through higher tax rates at upper income levels and other revenue adjustments. Employment flexibility would increase through longer fixed-term contracts without an objective justification, easier termination with severance mechanisms for some high earners, and preferential tax treatment for severance payments when workers move rapidly into new employment. The Federal Employment Agency would receive a larger role in moving workers directly from declining activities into new jobs through career counseling, transition hubs, retraining, and support for transfer companies. The Germany Fund would be expanded into a strategic investment instrument covering raw materials, energy infrastructure, economic security, young companies, small and medium-sized enterprises, and municipal entities. A new distribution grid package is intended to accelerate and digitalize electricity networks, improve connection visibility, and reduce implementation times. The government also plans a substantial smart meter rollout and clearer deadlines for industrial grid connections. Administrative reforms include a general 4-month approval mechanism for complete applications, digital tax procedures, reduced reporting obligations, risk-based supervision, and an intended 8% reduction in personnel across much of the federal administration. The program also explicitly prioritizes automotive manufacturing, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, clean technologies, mechanical engineering, battery cells, semiconductors, and artificial intelligence. The unresolved tension. The package explains what Germany wants to change. It does not yet establish whether the economy possesses the institutional, fiscal, labor, and infrastructure capacity required to deliver all of those changes simultaneously. 3 tensions remain unresolved: reform volume versus execution capacity. 34 measures create the appearance of comprehensive action, but many require future legislation, federal-state coordination, employer and union negotiations, European action, administrative digitalization, or new financing structures. The relevant issue is not how many reforms have been announced. It is how many can move from political commitment to functioning economic capacity. Strategic investment versus fiscal efficiency. Germany is seeking to support multiple capital-intensive sectors, while also financing pensions, defense, housing, energy infrastructure, public services, and tax relief. The package does not yet resolve how public capital will distinguish between investments that strengthen existing German capabilities, industries that can become internationally competitive, projects that require prolonged public support, assets whose strategic designation may conceal weak economics. AI ambition versus physical infrastructure. Germany wants to accelerate AI adoption and support semiconductor production. But AI expansion depends on more than software or individual chips. It requires reliable electricity, grid connections, data centers, advanced processors, high bandwidth memory, networking, cooling, specialized labor, commercially qualified supply chains. The reform package recognizes many of these components, but their interaction and sequencing remain uncertain. Partial structural diagnosis. Germany is not simply responding to weak growth. It is adapting to the erosion of the external conditions that supported its previous industrial model. For years, Germany benefited from relatively inexpensive Russian energy, strong Chinese demand, access to low-cost international inputs, predictable trade routes, low financing costs, globally distributed manufacturing, limited need to duplicate strategic capacity. That model was efficient but concentrated. The US-China trade conflict began introducing tariffs, technology controls, and political risk considerations before COVID. The pandemic then disrupted factories, logistics, labor mobility, and semiconductor availability. The European energy shock subsequently increased the operating cost of energy-intensive industry. The emergence of generative AI added a new source of pressure. Semiconductors, high-bandwidth memory, advanced packaging, electricity, data transmission, and specialized technical labor became increasingly strategic. The burden is therefore moving. Companies and governments are being asked to absorb more of the cost of supply chain redundancy, strategic inventories, domestic or allied production, energy resilience, technological security, workforce transition, infrastructure expansion. The emerging tension is between the resilience governments and companies now require and the low costs produced by the previous global system. Both cannot always be preserved at the same time. Selected driving forces. 1. Demographic and labor pressure. Germany's workforce is aging while pension, healthcare, and social security obligations are increasing. The reform package seeks to address this through longer employment participation, faster job transitions, vocational completion, revised benefit incentives, and greater employment flexibility. The broad implication is that labor policy is becoming part of industrial policy. Germany cannot expand grids, data centers, semiconductor projects, housing, and advanced manufacturing without sufficient engineers, technicians, construction workers, and skilled operators. The unresolved question is whether the measures can reallocate labor quickly enough to support new investment without aggravating shortages elsewhere. 2. Energy and infrastructure constraints. Electricity is becoming a central determinant of industrial competitiveness. This applies not only to traditional manufacturing, but also to AI data centers, semiconductor facilities, batteries, industrial electrification, automated production, advanced logistics. Germany's grid reforms acknowledge that electricity generation alone is insufficient. Power must be delivered to the required location, at the required scale, within an economically viable timeline. The broad implication is that future investment decisions may depend as much on grid access and connection certainty as on taxes or labor cost. The unresolved question is whether infrastructure can expand before new industrial and AI demand begins competing for the same limited capacity. 3. The shift from globalization to sectoral alignment. The previous global model selected suppliers primarily through cost, scale, and efficiency. The emerging model adds political reliability, sanctions exposure, export control risk, technological dependency, supply continuity, economic security. This does not mean that globalization is ending. It means that strategic sectors are being reorganized through overlapping alliances. Semiconductor design, fabrication, memory, equipment, packaging, energy, and critical materials are distributed across different countries. No major economy controls the complete chain. The broad implication is that Germany's competitiveness will depend not only on what it produces domestically, but on the quality and durability of its external industrial partnerships. The unresolved question is which dependencies Germany should reduce, which it should accept, and which it can secure through European or allied cooperation. What is most likely being underestimated? Announced investment is not the same as productive capacity. Governments and markets frequently measure industrial ambition through subsidy amounts, construction announcements, planned factories, nominal production capacity. But in semiconductors and other advanced industries, usable capacity also depends on manufacturing yield, process stability, customer qualification, supplier depth, energy access, packaging, maintenance, trained personnel. A project can be strategically attractive on paper while remaining commercially weak for years. This matters because industrial policy can generate fiscal commitments before it generates exports, productivity, or tax revenue. The cost of sequencing. Several German reforms could initially increase demand before expanding supply. Grid construction, data centers, semiconductor investment, housing, defense, and industrial modernization may all compete for labor, construction capacity, electrical equipment, finance support. Administrative downsizing could also weaken implementation if digitalization and shared services are not functional first. The underestimated risk is not necessarily that the reforms are wrong. It is that individually reasonable measures may interfere with one another when executed through the same constrained economy. Limited forward paths. Scenario A: selective execution and industrial renewal. Germany prioritizes a limited number of reforms with strong economic transmission. Grid access improves, administrative delays decline, labor transition mechanisms become operational, and AI adoption expands in industries where Germany already possesses engineering, manufacturing, and regulatory capabilities. Public investment attracts additional private capital, and Germany strengthens its position in selected areas of industrial automation, advanced manufacturing, energy systems, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, automotive technology, and specialized AI applications. Visible growth improves, but the economy remains exposed to higher energy, labor, and fiscal costs than before COVID. The unresolved issue would be whether the resulting productivity gains are sufficient to finance Germany's larger strategic and social obligations. Scenario B: fragmented implementation and subsidy drift. The reforms proceed unevenly. Some tax and subsidy measures take effect before grid, housing, labor, and administrative constraints are resolved. Strategic investment becomes dispersed across too many sectors. Projects compete for limited technical workers and infrastructure. Investment announcements increase, but qualified output and productivity improve more slowly. Fiscal pressure rises, creating greater political tension around taxes, subsidies, foreign investment, and the distribution of returns. The visible result would not necessarily be an immediate crisis. It could instead be prolonged low growth, combined with a higher public cost of maintaining industrial capacity. The institutional difficulty would lie in identifying which investments remain commercially viable once political support, energy pricing, and fiscal conditions change. Institutional relevance without the full exposure map. Several planning assumptions may no longer be reliable. Assuming that a large reform package guarantees improved execution, the number of measures does not show whether legal, administrative, and federal coordination barriers have been resolved. Assuming that a strategic sector is automatically an attractive investment sector, semiconductors, AI, batteries, and energy infrastructure may all be strategically important. Individual projects can still fail through low utilization, poor yield, weak local integration, or excessive subsidy dependence. Assuming that national incentives determine long-term project economics, entry incentives may support construction without guaranteeing future energy cost, regulatory continuity, fiscal stability, or investor exit conditions. Assuming that AI is primarily a software investment, AI deployment depends on physical infrastructure and industrial supply chains whose lead times may be substantially longer than software development cycles. These assumptions affect executive leadership, policymakers, manufacturers, infrastructure investors, technology companies, and long-horizon capital allocators. Why this matters? The principal risk is not that Germany's 34-point program has already failed. It is that companies, investors, and governments may allocate capital using an incomplete interpretation of what the program represents. Germany is not merely attempting to reduce bureaucracy or support weak growth. It is trying to reposition an industrial economy inside a more fragmented, capital-intensive, and technology-dependent global system. That transition affects which industries deserve support, which projects can operate without permanent subsidy, which infrastructure must precede investment, which international alliances can secure unavailable capabilities, which assumptions about energy, labor, and regulatory speed remain valid. A surface reading may treat the program as evidence that Germany has chosen a new growth strategy. A deeper reading must still determine whether the announced reforms form a coherent productive system or a collection of initiatives competing for the same limited fiscal, institutional, and industrial resources. BBIU Structural Judgment. Germany's 34-point reform program is not yet evidence of successful economic transformation. It is evidence that Germany recognizes that its previous industrial equilibrium cannot simply be restored. That judgment is supported by the package's simultaneous focus on labor supply, grids, housing, administrative execution, semiconductors, AI, strategic funds, and economic security policy. The principal limitation is implementation uncertainty. Several measures remain dependent on legislation, future financing, European coordination, federal-regional cooperation, and institutional behavior that cannot yet be observed. Institutional version availability. The institutional version expands this analysis with the full transmission mechanism, actor-specific exposure mapping, scenario conditioning, decision thresholds, and risk reduction options intended for organizations evaluating direct strategic, regulatory, industrial, contractual, treasury, or capital exposure. It also includes the country industry fit framework, fiscal efficiency assessment, AI infrastructure dependency map, implementation sequencing, host country behavior analysis, and investor exit risk architecture. Access is available for organizations with a defined decision context through BBIU's Structural Decision Context channel. When BBIU analysis creates friction, the friction itself is not the issue. The issue is what that friction reveals about structural exposure. This episode presents the public version of BBIU's analysis. The institutional version goes further. It includes the full structural assessment, deeper regulatory and geopolitical mapping, capital risk implications, and the decision-level interpretation designed for investors, executives, and institutions facing high-consequence uncertainty. BBIU's public content is intended to frame the issue. The institutional version is designed to support judgment. To request access or submit a confidential decision context, visit .biopharmabusinessintelligenceunit.com.